Okay, here we go. This is chapter 24, Spirit Guide. This will be part 1. Johnny no longer knew how many days and nights passed. He continued south along the coast. After leaving Wilbo and his little house in the sand, he saw no one. He saw no buildings. He saw no human footprints. He saw no smoke curling from a fire. The days were fog-bound, the nights lit with the flashing waves, the twinkling stars, and the occasional blinker crossing the sky. The constant murmur of the ocean, the cries of birds, the barking of the sea dogs on the rocks offshore, these things lulled him into a kind of undifferentiated forward motion in which he could lose himself in his thoughts. Over and over he relived the story, lingering on the clues as they appeared before him, linking them with others, seeking connections. The cornmeal sealed the known world. The trees that formed the border of free land grew steadily outward into the realm of chaos and cruelty. The knife that killed Glass Darkly was pounded out in no time in the known world, before the fires, before the borders were sealed. Bow Wow said, "Battle is the crowning triumph of chaos and cruelty. Our victory is always in the slow outward growth of the forest." On Pleasure Payne's wall in Ladyland hung the picture of the waterfall, the same image Lucy had given him. Frankie said, "Birdie Man wants me to harness the attractions to make our lives more comfortable. That doesn't interest me. It only keeps us here." One upon one, each phantom danced before him, then dissolved into another, helter-skelter, forward and backward across the spectrum of time. At some point, he realized he had left the ocean. He was still walking on sand, but the sound of the surf had faded. There were channels of water and tall stands of flat grass and cattails. Birds he recognized, big white egrets. Sometimes they startled him with their loud flapping wings. And little ducks and round black mud hens swam in the shallows. He stopped to rest on a drifted log. Something moved outside his vision. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. A grassy knoll. Fog. His feet were too restless to remain still. He got up, shouldered his pack, and continued south. Maybe. He couldn't be sure. There was no sun. He followed the footprint of the sand in what could have been a southerly direction. Again, movement just outside his vision on the left. This time, when he turned, he saw the grass closing over something that had entered it, but he did not see what it was. A flutter of birds took to the sky from a willow branch. A small breeze brought him the scent of fennel. He continued. Little by little, a trail was being formed, although not the sort made by men. Perhaps a hunting route for certain animals, or a long dried-up watercourse. Evening was approaching. He decided to sleep. He found a sheltered place where a dune coved him from the wind, and the sand was as soft as a feather bed. He drank some water, ate one of the wafers from the pack. Only a few left. He would have to find some food soon. Just before his eyes closed, he heard a sound in the tall grass. A slow rustling and a few soft snaps like twigs breaking. It reminded him of Rug Chumper, his childhood dog. How she used to circle 3 times around her cushion before settling down for the night. In the morning the fog persisted, but he could see by the pale glow of the sun that he was still traveling south. There was water everywhere, standing water, blanketed in mists, held captive in beaver dams and log jams, completely overgrown with berry brambles. He ate all the berries he could. They were sweet and juicy, but they made him feel a little drunk. A flood of blackbirds swarmed in and scolded him so severely he had to move on. 3 times that day, the hidden companion made herself known. The first was a sound, a crackling in the bracken, heavier than a bird or a small mammal. The second was the simple flicker of movement outside the corner of his eye. The third time he was ready. For a while he had been watching as he walked, and suddenly it happened. The grass quivered and a patch of gray fur slipped between the fronds. He called out to her, "Hey!" He heard the scamper of her hasty retreat. "Don't go! I want to see you! What do you want?" But she was gone, and there was no more from her the rest of the day. Evening. On the far, foggy horizon, a red light flickered. Closer, he saw that it was a fire, leaping and dancing. Still closer, he saw that there were people at the fire, tossing things into it. Even closer than that, he began to wonder if they were people. They stood on their hind legs, but they hunched over, and their movements were skittery and somewhat beast-like. And they had tails, and they were naked, but it was hard to tell at first because their bodies were covered with hair. The words of Mars Daniel echoed in his head. Those aren't people, those are hominids. You'd know they weren't people if you saw them with their skin on. He sat against a rock, concealed by its shadow, watching. They had some kind of stick structure, and a large, dark, skewered object was roasting over coals. He remembered something else, something Jason had narrated in Solomon's Tower. A great fire had broken out on the plains of Abelman. The entire city of Kidney Stone had been destroyed, and bands of flesh-eating hominids, roused from their caves, were migrating east. What was the secret of this place? Layer upon layer, the mysteries only deepened. Words disappearing from books became memories, and memories poured into words, and were lost in the oblivion of death and chaos. The wanderer has no real map. A guide appears just when you think you're lost, and you follow. It's a gift bestowed upon you by the whim of chance, but it only leads you deeper into chaos and mystery, layer upon mystery. He grew sleepy. He closed his eyes. It didn't really surprise him. when he heard the sound at a distance in the underbrush. The crackling, the rustling, the ritual of some creature circling 3 times before settling down for the night. In the morning, he walked over to inspect the campfire, now cold and abandoned. A bit of meat still clung to the skewer. He broke off a piece. It wasn't meat at all. It was some kind of fungus. He sniffed at it. It smelled clean and food-worthy. He tasted it. It was good. He ate it all. "We are not different," he said out loud. Before he left, he built a cairn of 3 small stones by the fire, and beside it he placed one of the packets of food given him by Bow Wow. He continued on his way. He did not count the days that followed. There was so little to see: fog, grass, wetlands, birds. The markers in the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, made but brief appearances, not long enough to establish any real sense of time. He could have counted the passages from light to dark and back to light again, but he chose not to. What did it matter? He was lost in his thoughts, reading the book of memory over and over from the beginning to the present, looking to shed some new light on the course of events. But no light came. Only the story itself, the twist of the plot, one thing moving into another, a ribbon unrolling into the darkness, a river rolling across a plain, a blinker drifting slowly through the sky. And always, and more, he sensed the presence of his companion. He heard the rustling of grass and sometimes the splash of soft paws in shallow waters. She was always a little ahead of him, and whenever he slept, whether it was day or night, she stopped, circled 3 times, and settled down, not beside him, but close enough to keep watch over him. Eventually the food ran out, and he knew he would have to find himself something to eat. He considered the birds. There were always birds, long-legged wading birds, fat little black coots, colorful larks and finches that circled in formation, throaty, scolding jays. He knew how to catch birds. He had relied on this often in the long treks between messages. It just took stillness and patience. He knew how to pluck them, gut them, and roast them. He built a blind by suspending his coat between 2 short willows, and he wove a disguise of green rushes to cover it. It was a warm afternoon with a weak sun shining in the sky, so he set out his metal water can at an angle to glint its light as an attractor. Then he waited. For a long time, a pod of little black coots sputtered about in the bog. No, he wasn't hungry enough for such mealy tidbits. Soon they were driven out by a family of young ducks, all too skinny to offer out much food value. He watched the shadow of the blind creep across the grass. An elegant white egret swooped down, and the ducks scattered. He was excited by the grace of her plumed white breast feathers, but he didn't think this was hunger. He had never eaten an egret before. She stabbed the water and came up with a fat, squirming bullfrog. Frogs, then. He had tasted frogs. But there was a disturbance in the grass behind him. The egret cocked her beak, and exercised her wings several times before she became airborne. Johnny held his breath and stilled his heartbeat so not to startle whatever it was that was approaching. A chuckling sound like a woman laughing at a silly joke. He knew that at once. It brought back a memory. Springfest at King Corn, the fattening of the wild turkeys. The hen hobbled into the open. She was indeed fat. Her ringed feathers wrapped her belly, and her dewlap flapped like a pancake as the sunlight off the metal reflected in her sidelong eye. 2 steps, and she pecked at the can. It rolled over. She ran after it. Johnny made his move. He grabbed the coat by the sleeves, lunged, and covered the now panicked and squawking turkey. She was strong and desperate and almost broke free. But Johnny located her neck in the squirming mound of feathers, and he snapped it with a quick, sure twist of his wrist. He spent the twilight hours plucking and cleaning and marveling at the great elation he felt at the act of taking a life so that he may continue to live his own. He found a sandy place, dug a circle, and built a fire with twigs and bracken. He laid the clean carcass directly on the coals. It was dark, and there were stars in the moonless sky by the time she was ready to eat. How good it felt, full of wild meat, reclining on a soft dune and able to see the stars after so many dark and starless nights. This was the joy of the road as he remembered it. This was the destination of the sojourner, peace and contentment at the center of the unknown. He glanced across the rippling disturbance of the rising flames. There was something out there. It moved, then stilled. A thrill of recognition coursed up his spine. She was the skinniest wolf he had ever seen. She sat on her haunches, her legs like candlesticks, her ribs like barrel staves. But she was not small. Her sinews rippled and her head slouched between bony shoulders, almost as tall as a man's. She was watching him. She had been for a while, and she knew what he had been eating. Her moist pink tongue quivered and dribbled from her mouth. They sat, eye-locked, man and wolf, for a long time. He was not afraid. Not after the initial shock wore off. But she was, he could tell. Yet more than afraid, she was hungry. He knew what he had to do. Without moving his head, he looked at his hands, holding the bone still heavy with flesh. He took his time. He imagined raising his arm before he actually did it. But still he was too fast. With a whimper, she shied and turned. But not for long. Still within the fire's glow, she turned back, her head low, her eyes darting. He held out his arm full length. "Here," he said. "You can have it. And there's more. I want to thank you." His voice startled her, but she approached, sniffing, her teeth sharp and white, closed around the meat and bone. Then she vanished, the broken rushes closing behind her. She did not go far. He heard her crunching on the cartilage in the bushes, her voice worrying the flesh from the gristle. He pulled more meat from the carcass, boneless white meat from the breast. It wasn't long before she returned. She was calmer, less desperate. She ate in his presence, her head bowed, glancing up at him inquisitively. He spoke to her. "I hope you don't leave me. I want to go home. To the known world, to Aberdeen and King Corn. I hope you can guide me there. Whatever I catch, I'll share with you. Please, stay with me." She listened, her head on the ground, between her paws. He couldn't think of anything else to say, and he began to sense an uneasiness as if he had crossed a border into some place he didn't belong. At the same time, she startled, suddenly, as if in realization. He is man. I am beast. With one wary eye on him, she backed out of the circle of firelight. Then she disappeared into the night. Later, as he prepared for sleep, he heard the familiar sound, not far away, a wolf circling 3 times before setting in for the night.